after this description, the narrator's voice stays with Nora, who is expecting some kind of comment from the people watching the telly. And when none comes, she says to her brother-in-law, what do you think? And he says, that's one scrap I wouldn't like to be in, he said. There'll be no easy way out of that one. And that's all he says. Northern Ireland is represented as something nobody can take in. Even when the daughter, Nora has 4 children, and one of them is a student in Dublin, the daughter actually gets involved in the protests. But everybody in Enniscorthy apparently turns away from the television and they talk about anything else. When Haughey's gun running comes up in conversation, Nora supports him because, of course, he gave her the widow's pension. Now, when I first read this novel, I was kind of irritated by it. I think I was resistant to it. I reacted against the small world which was being represented. Can't you give us something bigger? We know you can do Enniscorthy, I was thinking. But I think I was missing a critique that Tobin inserts into the novel, or a comment at least, as Tobin appears to acknowledge that a narrow, and I'm going to say familial focus, may be both a strength and a weakness. It is, I think, again, worth noting that the critique, if there is one, is made manifest, again, through generational conflict. The turn away from political, acknowledging political crisis is not just the turning aside of the small town, but of the older generation. As I've mentioned, the student daughter does get involved in the protests, and she even appears on the telly, which I think is a very clear way in which Tobin wants to make the make the point that they're sitting there and they go, oh my God, there's Anya, who's on the Late Late Show. The Enniscorthy elders can't take it in. Now, I want to be careful about how I make the following point because I'm conscious it could be misunderstood. If I'm right about Tobin's appraisal of an inward-looking society in the 1960s, I think it may have some consequences for how we think about the current 16 commemorations. Debates about Ireland's revolutionary past have been rancorous, almost as though they are displacements for thinking about the more recent past, such as Northern Ireland. It's one of the reasons why I think the mixing of memory and history in Irish fiction, drama and performance is so important, because it forces us to confront those gaps in the story in productive ways. Clearly, too, the commemorative year has had a real effect in furthering thinking about the history of the state and the whole project of national sovereignty. Tremendous amount of new historical work on the broader politics of the Rising, as David's talk this morning was a brilliant example of. And I think, in fact, the UCD book that is part of, coming out of the commemorations as well. So there's a huge amount of great historical work. And at the same time, the Irish government's insistence on inclusivity in the commemorations has also meant that social, in addition to political history, has come to the fore. Who would have anticipated that the major Rising bestseller would turn out to be Joe Duffy, Children of the Rising, about the 38 children accidentally killed during Easter week, though in fact, I point out that fits with the generational plot that I've been tracing. So, I think it's certainly true that the commemorations have opened up fixed attitudes towards the past, and not just about revolutionary history. One instance I give is the 1916 Home 2016 project, which is again supported by commemoration funding, and which has been looking, not just looking at the history of the incarceration of Irish individuals in various kinds of home, primarily Magdalene institutions, but also producing multimedia and site-specific performance work as part of the attempt to remember or recall those histories. So there's a big creative element to that, to the commemorations. So, the commemorations have provided a public forum for the discussions on, for example, the hidden histories of industrial schools, Magdalene institutions, mother and baby homes. Work that's been happening within both academic circles and in government-funded commissions. Yet at the same time, the government has carried on building and funding, for example, direct provision centres, which are arguably the current equivalent of such institutions, and arguably will be a similar source of similar shame. The camps are where asylum seekers are held while their claims are being processed, and the Irish Refugee Council has argued that they are illegal under both the Irish Constitution and the European Convention of Human Rights. It's as though memory finds it hard to deal with the recent past, the past we can actually remember, and we can barely look at the present at all. In that regard, I wonder whether Tobin's telly-watching scenes should not give us pause. The familial narrative, which is so all-pervasive in the fiction, is perhaps a version of the social history excavation that has been going on, for example, with the Magdalene institutions. Both share the concern I've been outlining with the family as a microcosm of the failed state. The uncovering of those hidden histories is vitally important, but perhaps it also comes at a cost of not being able to square up to the present. It's important that a light should be shone on past social injustice in the Republic, but the flip side of that is that political effects, even ongoing ones like Northern Ireland, can be sidelined, in effect not thought about at all. Perhaps we should welcome the shift away from the emphasis on the border and the Troubles as a principal focus of the legacy of 1916. The 1991 commemorations were all about the North, but it was a concern of academics primarily, rather than the public at large. As Tobin suggests in his novel, the people in the Republic never really wanted to think about the North at all. Now the Troubles can be legitimately set aside while people focus on the social consequences of independence. And at the same time, republicanism can be celebrated in a way which would have been inconceivable 25 years ago during the 1991 commemorations. There's a final example of the working out of a legacy. If I've got time, have I got time to look at one more thing? I want briefly to return to the subject of migrants and outsiders, return to the issue of racial difference, which I've suggested has been bracketed by a century of trying to forget about it. I began by talking about the boundaries of the nation and Joyce's almost uncanny ability to see that that was the question raised by independence, or the struggle for independence. Or maybe it wasn't uncanny, he just didn't look away. The migrant has appeared in Irish literature over the 20th century primarily as an emigrant, not an immigrant, and arguably there are very obvious reasons for that. But since I'm arguing that established literary patterns, tropes, and plots can get in the way of thinking as much as enable it, it may also be that focusing on the emigrant has consequences for the ability of contemporary literature to respond to the current migrant crisis. Like the environmental emergency in Ireland, which is also both a global and a national emergency, the issue of asylum seekers and refugees arriving in Ireland is primarily being dealt with by political and legal activists, and less so by writers and artists. And I now want to offer a couple of counterexamples to that claim, and you may well have others, which I think touch in interesting ways on the question of